Okay, the state has rested in the Murdaugh trial. The defense had their first day of testimony. One of the first witnesses it put up is Buster, the surviving son of Alex Murdaugh. This was some pretty substantial, significant testimony yesterday. Patrick, what's your takeaway?
Well, I would say that it was big testimony. I mean, Buster has been acknowledged as not being highly emotional throughout this trial. In my opinion, a little bit unfairly criticized for his reactions to some of the evidence, that he's not showing any emotion and everything. I think that that's being a little unfair to somebody who's had their mother and their brother murdered. But his testimony was, again, not very emotional. However, I think that the biggest takeaway for me was that it's clear that Buster Murdaugh does not believe his father killed his brother and his mother. Now, I think that that was clear from his testimony. That's a big moment if he's standing behind his dad.
The jury's going to have to read credibility into this case because there's no eyewitness. How people reacted and how Alex Murdaugh reacted in the immediate aftermath of these killings is a big part of the state's argument because they don't have much else. And it's a big part of the defense's argument because they're going to say, hey, if we're going on reactions, if you're going to try to make a meal out of how people perceive someone's reactions to things, whether they're crying or not crying, whether they seem calm or not calm, we've seen over and over again it's cutting both ways, right? But I think that especially cuts in favor of the defense because we have these very bizarre phone calls right after the murders must have happened, most likely happened. And if indeed Alex Murdaugh had just committed them, he was not affected at all by them. The witness at the home said he didn't seem abnormal at all. These very relaxed phone calls where he's talking about cases with his law partners. If he had done it, he would have just committed grisly murders, 20 minutes before. The reactions, though, are important in this trial because there's not much else. So I think it was very helpful for the defense to have the jury hear from Buster that it doesn't seem like there's a doubt in his mind. His dad didn't kill these people. And I think you're going to also hear more from these witnesses who talked to him around the time these killings probably occurred, where he does not appear to be someone who just committed 2 grisly murders of his closest family members.
I think that's pretty beneficial to the defense.
And I think that he's the only surviving member of this immediate family now. And I think if they did not testify, the jury would be wondering, well, what does he think? That could have been really bad had they not called him. But, he knows these people and can read them like nobody else, right? And what does he think? So I do think it's important. There was other testimony yesterday about trajectory evidence. There was an expert witness who testified about some things that was pretty shocking. Essentially, what did this guy say about who would have pulled this trigger?
So I think it's important to recognize before you get too far into that evidence or that testimony, this expert was brought in by the defense to be an expert in 3 different subject matters, right? And the state did not object to him being an expert.
Let's clarify for people, there may have been pretrial motions about some of these experts that happened before the trial. That might have been just to not waste time rehashing arguments that had already been made. But some of these experts those battles may have been fought before the actual jury trial started.
Sure. But if I'm sitting on the jury and I hear that, I think that the reason it's important is because the jury doesn't know that. And the jury just hears, yes, no objection to him being qualified as an expert. And then the way they treated his testimony afterwards was like, you're not an expert. So if I'm on the jury and not knowing all the procedures and everything that take place before a jury trial, it's going to be confusing. But he was a mechanical engineer and he was testifying about the physics of the evidence, right? So he was basically testifying to the trajectory of the shots based on the state's evidence. He examined the evidence based on the measurements of SLED investigation. And so he takes their data and he recreates the scene as it was laid out by SLED. And then he used various different calculations to determine the trajectory of the shots. One of the biggest issues I think the state had with his testimony was surrounding Maggie being shot. There was an area where the 2 lines for the shootings intersected. And his position, I believe, was that that is most likely where the shots came from, right? So you have these two lines. And if they intersect right around that point, it would make the shooter a very short person. He estimated the shooter would have to be shooting from the hip at the angle of the shots. It would put the shooter between 5'2" and 5'4". Alex Murdaugh is 6'4". And he testified that in order for Alex Murdaugh to make these shots, he would have to be holding his gun below his knee because of the length of his calf. That's just an incredibly unnatural shooting position to shoot.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway there was they basically had an expert witness who said Alex Murdaugh could not physically have made these shots. And that's important because we don't have any physical evidence here. There's very little evidence. We don't have a murder weapon. We just don't have a lot about the weapons, the ballistics, etc., other than the bodies and analyzing the directions the shots came from by the entry and exit wounds, estimating how close they were. We don't have a lot. Given that the state doesn't have the weapon, but has basically a theory about what that weapon is, the defense is now showing, well, if that's the theory, it's impossible for him to have made that shot. It's going to be a difficult thing for the state to overcome potentially. Now, they will be allowed to bring rebuttal witnesses. I wouldn't be surprised if someone at SLED is going to come in and testify that it was possible. That's something to look for.
And the state, their cross-examination of this expert was a little distasteful. The prosecutor handling that cross-examination was extremely dismissive of the testimony. The estimated height that this expert brought in about the shooter, he had these images that showed the trajectory of the shot, and he put these kind of creepy-looking robot figures holding guns down at their sides. The state's attorney was like, okay, so now let's look at the 12-year-old you've got standing here holding the shotgun. You know, what's this youth, where's this youth going now? And he was just kind of mocking it. And for me, I was listening to it and I was like, y'all had weeks of testimony and you never brought any of this up. It almost was like all they could do with that evidence was mock it because they didn't present any of that same evidence. It came off a little unconvincing. The other thing that he testified to that was important was he was brought in as an audio expert as well. So he ran some tests and he gave a lot of data about how sound travels, what the decibel level is of regular things going on inside of a house. And he sat in the house and recorded, and they played this in the courtroom. He recorded himself in the house and somebody shooting a shotgun, 12-gauge shotgun at the kennels, and you couldn't hear a thing.
That's important because I think
he said that if you were outside, you would have heard it. But if you're inside this well-built home, you're not going to hear it. The state tried to dismiss a lot of that argument as well because they started focusing on trees, that the trees had grown because it was 18 months later. Well, if we go by the cell phone data, could he have been in the house at the time? And I think that's a question. And we'll see. I think the only person that could give us that information is Alex Murdaugh.
Yeah, which we'll see if he testifies. This is going to be really interesting. We see this week what the defense is going to throw back at us here because it definitely ended much stronger with the state last week. I felt like by the end of their 3 weeks of evidence that I felt the case was much stronger by the end than it started out for sure. But by the end of it, you started to get a complete picture that he definitely at least could have committed these murders. There was some bad testimony about timing that definitely kind of leaned towards conviction in my mind.
Another thing that he did revisit was the state presented that GM data about him slowing down at the place where Maggie's phone was found and then a great acceleration. From his testimony, Alex turned onto, I guess that would be Moselle Road or whatever road where the phone was found. He turned onto that road and was gradually increasing his speed. And he showed at the time that phone would have been thrown out the window. He was still accelerating.
Let's talk about that, because for me, the most damning evidence in the trial so far has been the testimony that he was driving around the area of the phone and then sped away right around the time that the phone was thrown out. At the close of the state's evidence last week, the biggest takeaway that I had that was that's going to probably get him convicted is the automobile data that the state's witness says puts his vehicle at the approximate location of where the phone was eventually found at the approximate time that her phone recorded its last orientation changes, and that his vehicle slowed down and then immediately sped up as if it was speeding away from the scene, implying that he threw the phone out and then sped away. That's really damning testimony for me. To me, that was like, okay, the puzzle is now more complete. That was a big missing piece that they've been able to fill. I think you have a different opinion about that, and based on some of the defense expert witness testimony that occurred yesterday. What's your takeaway?
Well, and it's not only the defense's testimony, it was during cross. I think that the defense took that same data and questioned that same expert about whether or not he truly slowed down. And the expert was inconclusive on whether or not he slowed down. And I think also the timing of it, if you look at the time, I believe the timing of the phone changing for the last time, there was a question that was raised. Well, it says that there was an orientation change from portrait to landscape at this time. And then the very last time that it changed, it was a change to landscape. So there's no intervening change from portrait before the alleged last change. So that's kind of a question. Okay, well, how is it a change from landscape to landscape? That doesn't make sense. And there was no explanation provided. But also, I believe that the last change was almost a minute and a half before Alex Murdaugh passed that location.
So I heard the state, that makes sense too, because one of the state's last questions about the phone was if the phone was already locked, like it already settled into lock, and somebody threw it out the window, would it necessarily record a change at that time? And right. I don't think that was conclusive. So the state was leaving open the possibility there could have been that the toss out the car could have occurred, a minute or two later as he's traveling to the other property.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a little bit inconclusive, but the state presented the evidence as if he was slowing down. They didn't omit it from the evidence, but they omitted talking about the fact that he was on a steady increase, a gradual increase in acceleration.
What's the speed limit on that road?
I think it's 55. I don't know.
Okay, so 70 is not far out. And anybody that's lived on, remote country roads where there's like basically 4 deputies covering a 400-mile square area, like people speed all the time on those roads. So 70 is not like he was fleeing a scene or anything like that. It's 15 miles over the speed limit.
And he
always drives. I'm sure if they looked at his other data, they could see how fast he typically would drive that road because he drove it almost every day.
I think that that was a question that I think it was Dick Harpootli brought that up. He said, did you check into how he drove previous trips to the Alameda property? How did he usually drive to that location? And the investigator didn't have an answer for that. So obviously, I think that the defense is probably going to bring that up. But yeah,
I think that's key, man. I think this is going to be kind of how the jury reacts to this and looks into this cell phone, because this whole conviction is going to be based on where people's cell phones and cars said they were at certain times. And wherever it's not consistent, it's going to be a problem. And if the state is seen, especially in closing argument, when they're going to go through this timetable, for the jury the last time and say, this is how we know this, this, and this. And if it looks like they're trying to mislead them on stuff, that's going to be a bad look, because this jury is going to have to rely on no eyewitnesses, no DNA, no blood evidence. There's no physical evidence in this case at all, to be honest.
No, yeah.
So basically, you're going to be asking me to convict somebody based on what some cell phone data says. And if Harpootli and the defense can show that that's just not reliable enough, then there's an acquittal.
Yeah. The state's relying on a possible explanation, but there are numerous other possible explanations, and I don't think they do themselves any favors by simply mocking the other possible explanations. They did try to say, well, what if he was stepped back along that line? They did get in some possibilities as far as the shooting trajectory and everything else, but think that by that time the damage was done. In my opinion, if I'm sitting on the jury, I would say, okay, well, they're too defensive on this. They're trying to convince me by mocking this person's expertise that they just said he was an expert.
Yeah. All right. Good deal. Well, we'll see what happens. We might have the defendant take the stand, which is always a blockbuster day. We'll see if they risk it. Unclear. So he might testify on Thursday. So we'll see if that's going to be the case.
Yeah. Be interesting.
All right. Make sure you hit the like button and make sure you subscribe. We'll be covering this trial daily. We've been there since the beginning. We're going to be there until the end.